Thank you all again for being willing to join us today to talk about legislative advocacy. We're grateful to have these representatives from our denomination who have been doing these visits and can share some of their wisdom with us. So I was wondering if you could start by introducing yourselves, a little about the work that you do, and why do you think that we as disciples are engaging in these types of visits?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Reverend Dr. Sharon Stanley-Rea. I work as Disciples, Refugee, and Immigration Ministries Director, a ministry of Disciples Home Missions. And I am very excited that we, as a full collective partnership of multiple justice-oriented ministries within the Disciples denomination, from Refugee and Immigration Ministries, from the Center for Indigenous Ministries, Disciples Public Presence, Alliance Q, Green Chalice, Global Ministries, and more, NBA and others, that we have been working together throughout the summer to help this really be experienced as a summer of justice. So we are inviting individuals and congregations and regions now to join together in a culmination of our summer of justice by partnering together in holding advocacy visits. And our visits are a culmination of that summer of justice. They also, we hope, are a new way that we can build and strengthen the muscle for doing advocacy, for speaking our faith values in ways that hopefully will produce more justice and systems change around our country and throughout the globe.
This is Peter Makari, and I serve as executive for the Middle East and Europe in Global Ministries, Division of Overseas Ministries, with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and United Church of Christ. My main responsibilities are for our partner relationships in the Middle East and Europe, as well as supervision of the mission co-workers that we have appointed to serve with partners in the region at their invitation, as well as participating in the education of our churches here about the main issues of the region that our partners are facing there, and engaging in advocacy around what our partners are calling for us to do. And so we, as a Christian church in the United States and Canada, base our engagement in the world on the scriptural texts and the examples that we read there that Christ lays out for us. And those are also informed by the connections that we have globally, the connections that link us to Christians and people all over the world. And we hear from them, we hear their perspectives that inform the way that we go about our work here. And we realize that the policies of the governments that we participate in have impact globally. And so as part of our Christian faith, we engage in advocacy, lifting up those voices from partners around the world.
This is Ken Brooker Langston, and I am the Executive Director of the Disciples Center for Public Witness and the Director of Disciples Justice Action Network, DJAN. Disciples are involved in public policy advocacy, really all kinds of advocacy, because disciples have an identity where it says a church, in order to be authentic, in order to be wholesome and growing, needs to have three things: deep Christian spirituality, true community, and a passion for justice. So what we as disciples try to do, those of us who are involved in various forms of advocacy, we try to take those things, we try to be in deep Christian spirituality as our grounding, and then take this vision of true community and this passion of justice and take it into the public sphere. And there, through a variety of means, protests, vigils, all kinds of things in the public, taking it to the public policymakers, because somebody's going to make public policy, we might as well be involved. And that's the reason we do what we do.
Now, I'm wondering, you all have a lot of experience going and leading meetings with members of Congress. How do you discern what you ask for in those meetings?
Well, this is my view. I think people have different answers to this question. But my view is first, discernment requires prayer and Bible study. And I think if we really pray the Psalms and the Lord's Prayer, when we look at Matthew 25 about the judgment, about the least of these, and we also look at the inaugural sermon of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, then we're going to get an idea of what God's priorities are, and they're going to guide our priorities. Second, I think it works best if a congregation or a region is involved in some kind of activity already, whether it be housing, whether it be poverty, whether it be hunger, whatever it may be, and try to connect public policy to that issue or concern. And then third, I think it really depends on what's happening now and how important an issue is, how easy it is to get your voice heard, and how you connect that to the issue you care about. Those, I think, are the three, for me, most important ways to discern what an ask will be.
I fully agree with what Ken has shared with us, and would add that what we are hearing from our global partners is very important for how we engage issues pertaining to foreign policy, and to be able to understand how U.S. policy, for example, impacts people in another part of the world, and how U.S. foreign policy could be changed or improved to make significant changes toward justice is important for us. That informs the way that we can discern how to engage with our elected representatives, as well as the positions that have been adopted by the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Those positions are voices of the church, and so those are positions that we have a responsibility to bring forward in our advocacy, because the church is calling us to do that. So the combination of hearing from partners as well as using what the church is saying as a policy base informs how we approach our engagement with elected officials.
I would say we determine how to advocate and what we're going to be speaking about, first of all, because at base we know we all care about engaging in such conversations and raising our voices and our values of faith, because it's our calling. It's our calling from God, and before it was our calling, it was, as we see in the scriptures, the calling of Jesus Christ, as he came into the synagogue in Nazareth and spoke it out in chapter 4 of Luke. And of course, even as he spoke about his calling to care for those who needed to hear the news lifted up in ways that could sound good to them, but he spoke about the need to release the captives and bring recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free and proclaim liberty to those who were not feeling liberty. He knew that he was doing it as well because the prophets before him also had felt that common calling. So we engage in advocacy as a continuation of that biblical calling. We engage in advocacy knowing that as we take our own individual voices, even if they may be fearful in that moment or lacking confidence perhaps, that we go knowing that Jesus also was filled with the Holy Spirit, and as Jesus was, we can be too. And we've seen year after year and decade after decade that often it is the voices of individual common communities of faith as they go forward to speak faith power to power, that those voices frequently are listened to and frankly are able to be heard. And I think there's some significant reasons why. I mean, part of that is because as we go to speak power to power, we are taking the knowledge of statements that our denomination has made. We are taking forward relationships of power with directly impacted communities who have informed us. And we are taking those forward in ways that continue to build on a heritage. And we also know that most leaders who are themselves legislators are likewise people of faith. So we go in part attempting and looking for that common ground that we can anticipate we have, and we seek to build conversations upon that common ground. And I think as disciples, one of the most amazing voices that we have in our own recent history that we can point to is the 5-time governor of Iowa, Governor Rea, who himself was from a Republican tradition. He served for so many years, but he served so capably because he was consistently bringing forward his voice of faith values across the aisle and to us as disciples as well, reminding us to not leave our scripture behind when we come into the halls of Congress and before leaders.
Thank you all. This is really helpful, but it's very conceptual. I wonder if there are specific examples you could give of legislative visits that you've done that you think have gone particularly well, or focused on a specific piece of legislation.
Yeah. Well, over my years of doing this, which have been quite a few, there have been a lot of failures trying to get legislation passed. I try not to dwell on that because there's been some successes as well. Things like Jubilee 2000, the debt relief. Faith community was very involved in that. Healthcare reform, the faith community was very involved in that. Obviously, as Sharon knows, prosecutorial discretion and DACA, both the faith community has been very involved in that. So there's a number of things that we've had success at. Part of it is mobilizing and having an inside and an outside game. Your inside game is when you go in and you start talking to the representatives or their staff, or the senators or their staff, and you have a game plan, which we can talk about. But also outside, so that the public is with you, so that people see what you're doing, what you believe, and why you're doing what you're doing. That tends to do two things. People who are open, leaders who are open to change their minds, it gives them something to think about in terms of changing their minds. If it's a pressure on someone who won't change their mind, you get enough going, then they have to think about it. And a lot of times I got to tell you, the things that work the best is when a representative or a senator actually wants your help. When they actually ask you for help, they say, send us a letter, come in and testify, do a briefing, whatever it might be. Then things get rolling along.
I've been involved in a number of visits over the last few months during this pandemic, and one of the main foci of these visits has been the Caesar Act and sanctions on Syria. This is something that the U.S. implemented just a few weeks ago after voting on it a few months ago. And it's an extension and an intensification of sanctions on parts of the Syrian regime. But what we are understanding and hearing from our partners is that sanctions in this case, just as in many cases around the world, as well as throughout the Middle East, are having a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable people. So what we have been able to convey in a number of meetings with representatives and elected officials is the actual impact of sanctions as opposed to the theoretical impact of sanctions. And to be able to bring those voices to the halls of power, to be able to help inform from a different perspective and not from a theoretical debate, but to have real stories, has been impactful. Now, of course, as Ken said, some visits are more successful than others. And there are times when a staffer or a representative's ideological bent is unchangeable, so that no matter what you ring and tell them and share with them, they're rigid. They won't change their perspective. But you hope that even in those meetings, they will be able to have heard something different that might impact the way they think about a similar issue in the future, even if there's no chance for change now. The other aspect is the meetings that feel more successful, where a representative or a staffer may have thought that he or she was doing the right thing, but didn't have all the information, and acknowledges that and recognizes that there's more to this than I understood before, and that they do ask for more information and are willing to have follow-up conversations with voices such as ours, who provide perspectives that they don't often have access to. So even on a single issue and in several meetings, you can have success and failure at the same time, or what feels like that. But it's really important to continue to persist and to continue to raise the voices of those whose voices aren't always heard. And we have an opportunity, because of the special access that we have to partners and the relationships that we nurture, to bring those voices to those offices and to those meetings.
I think that one of the important aspects of legislative visits that is critical to remember is that legislative visits are really especially about building relationships. In many ways, building those relationships and strengthening our partnerships starts before you go into a visit, and it continues as you are in that visit, often because honestly, staff members continue to change again and again. Mm-hmm. But it continues as we know that part of what we can do as communities of faith is really live and move into the Hebraic tradition of what it means to be apocalyptic. And that means we are there to help shine a light, to bring new information. Hopefully, as I have seen too, some of the best legislative visits, as others have mentioned, are those where we are in the visit together with individuals who are most directly affected by the policies. I think back to a year ago when Joanne Bell Haynes, as one of our amazing regional ministers with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, was willing to step into national legislative visits, something that was a bit newer to her. But she did that as a part of a team together with dozens of others from around the country, but visiting her local leaders nationally in partnership with refugees who brought their voices, their personal experience to bear, so that she was able then to support and stand in critical partnership and solidarity with those refugees who were most effective. And indeed, their visit had a real change of heart for their Congressperson Buck, and he ended up helping to co-author the refugee support legislation that encouraged others in his political party to jump on. And I also think it's important as we're making visits to think about visiting those who might be most critical potential influencers on legislation. So if we're working on refugee-related legislation, sometimes that's members of Judiciary Committee. When we're talking about COVID support, that may well be related to those who play key roles around appropriations. And often we forget to really do that research about our own leaders and find out what are the key roles that they play, because that helps us strategically think about how to hopefully affirm something that they have done in the past, which helps us in our relationship building, but also nurture them towards whatever the asks are that we're carrying into that particular meeting, and encourages them to use their power in ways that we as faith communities might be able to support and appreciate.
That's helpful to think about doing your research about the member you'll be visiting with, finding out their backgrounds or connections to the issue. What other logistics do you consider when planning these visits, especially now that some of these need to be virtual visits?
Yeah, virtual has changed some things. We're still trying to figure that out. I don't know about the rest of you, but we are. Things like time zones, you wouldn't think about before. Now you have to think about that. You have to tell people about that. Prepping, you have to do that in a different way than you are accustomed to doing it when you all get together as a group and sit down at a table in the Senate, building before you go have a visit. I can think of lots of things that you start having to think about different platforms. A lot of staffers, they may offer the platform or they might go on your platform. You got to figure that kind of logistic out. It's been my experience, for example, that most staffers obviously don't want to be recorded, for number one. Number two, they're nervous about getting onto a platform like Zoom where everybody can see everybody. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so it has to be audio or a phone call, even in this age of Zoom. So you just have to think about those things. Some of the things are the same, like getting on the call 5 or 10 minutes ahead of time, making sure you play your part, not going over the time that you've been allotted. I think that the stories that were mentioned are key. They are key, because I've been in so many meetings where those of us who are the advocates talked and they kind of listened, and then the people told their stories and they were mesmerized. You can't contradict somebody's experience and their story. You can contradict their list of facts or their list of statistics or whatever that is. So that's key. One more thing I'd say key that continues from the time before and the time we're in now, except you might have to do it a little differently now, is always be gracious and thankful and respectful and as generous a spirit as you can have, even as you're urging for a particular ask, because that's the relationship building that Sharon was talking about.
There are most certainly a lot of additional complexities in advocating during this time of COVID, but I have been immensely excited to see new possibilities emerge as well. It is complicated. It takes more preparation ahead of time, that sense, as Ken was mentioning, of identifying the platform, deciding if you're using your Zoom account or the legislative office's WebEx account, making sure you share that information with everyone who's participating in the meeting, being certain that you are, as an advocacy time, meeting carefully ahead, sharing the research you've done. Identifying the roles is even more important when a visit is happening virtually, because you want to minimize the number of bumps between speakers and you want to use your time as well as possible. And yet last month, I was grateful that we as Disciples of Christ had a number of individuals who were able to participate together with over 400 other community members from multiple faith backgrounds in a national virtual asylum advocacy days. We have another similar kind of faith advocacy days, also obviously still virtual, that will be happening at the beginning of September as well, around refugee issues. So it really is possible to bring more directly impacted community members to the table, and even to be able to potentially bring more lay leaders and pastors to a common table of that visit, because your schedules can align. And it's much cheaper. People don't have to fly. or in this moment take health risks to do that through travel, to go to Washington or even to go to the legislative office that is near or in their hometown.
Yeah, I would agree with what has been said already. And in my experience so far, I haven't had an opportunity to have a visual meeting. In other words, not through Zoom or Skype or something like that. The advocacy meetings, actually many of them that I've been involved in these last few months, have all been on the congressional secure conference call line. So it's really a challenge to read body language, to know who's eager to speak and who's waiting to say something. In these cases, you know, we may have 3 or 4 or more of us in the meeting, and we need to make sure that we know who's going to say what and in what order, because we can't just look at them and, you know, turn it over to them. It's also hard to keep track of who's in the room from the representatives staff because you can't see them. And you don't have an opportunity even to have any, you know, just a short chat with them at the very beginning to get to know them in a few sentences. So all of that is challenging. I would say that yes, it is easier to be able to bring multiple voices in, but it's also really important to make sure that you identify yourselves as constituents, or you identify who the constituent is in the group that's meeting, because they want to know that there is somebody in their district who actually can vote for them or not. That's really important. And in a virtual meeting, when people are calling in from all over the country or even the world, it's really important for them to know that maybe a vote is at stake here. And so, you know, that electoral calculus plays into it as well. And there's a greater willingness to receive an invitation to meet if a constituent is involved. And the opportunity to follow up is just as important. So at an end of a meeting, you know, in this relationship building, make sure to offer to continue to be engaged and write an email and follow up and say, you know, I'm prepared to share more information. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch. But make sure that the end of the call isn't the end of the discussion, and that you can continue to engage.
One footnote to thing that I would say about the Zoom era or the new normal or whatever it is that in the past, we've had more experiences of going in for meetings where the representative or the senator might actually show up just long enough to shake people's hands, say hello, get a picture taken with the group, whatever. And obviously, now that just doesn't happen, that kind of personal contact. And my understanding is too that a lot of the older senators particularly, but not all of them, but a lot of them, and then some of the other people in Congress just don't like this platform. And they're just not going to get on it. So that's the difference too. I mean, advocates should know that they're probably going to meet the staff, but it's always good when the member walks in. So, and
it really can cut both ways. I think during the pandemic time, we've had some experiences where a member may not show up. We've also had one meeting where a member scheduled an hour of time with a group, which really, in my experience, has been unheard of to have that significant time as an audience. So again, preparing really well makes you feel comfortable in that case where that might happen. We also should maybe just remind folks too, it's always helpful to the office as well as helpful in demonstrating that some in the meeting, or hopefully most of the meeting, are constituents. If we send the listing of both individual names, where they live, if they have particular leadership roles in organizations or in our congregations, that we know staff always seem to find that helpful. And it can also be helpful if communities of faith work to build relationships both in the local offices and with the national offices. When that happens, there's less of a potential that one office might try to refer you to the other, and in that way sort of get rid of your concern. But you have, we multiply our power when we build relationships both with national and with local offices.
Yeah, in the past, I would have said, go to the district office is one thing that I learned. I'm not sure I would say that anymore. Obviously in the past, you could send 500 to 1,000 names to Congress in a national setting, and, it goes in the pile with the others, but not always, but a lot of the time. But you get 50 to 100 calls, emails, people wanting to meet in a district office, and they go crazy. There's like something happening here, and they have to contact the people and let them know something's going on. I haven't quite figured out if that's the same yet in this time of the Zoom era. We'll have to see.
I would say too that there's a difference sometimes between the familiarity of in-district staff and Washington-based staff on any given issue. So sometimes it's helpful just to try to suss that out and figure out who's got the expertise and who is the right person to talk to. The relationships with both the local office, the in-district office, and the Washington office are important. Of course, in August, we're looking at the congressional recess, whenever that might start, and so this is an opportunity where the representative or senator is in the district, so there's an opportunity possibly for a meeting with the representative, her or himself, locally. And whether that's by telephone or Zoom, certainly, the in-person opportunities may be limited, but even so, contacting the in-district office during the recess might be beneficial as well.
And I can't help but think of the documentary about John Lewis that has just come out, right, of Good Trouble, and the images of Congressman Lewis, both at the national level in his work and when he was in the local office. And the scene where Congressman Lewis was in his local office and was dancing to the song Happy, and his staff spoke and said, sometimes in the district office, things are more relaxed. They can feel more personal. It can be the place where, especially individuals who are making visits in those district offices, take opportunity to make linkages between relationships and partners and experiences that you've had in the district with the staff members. So both offices are truly important, and in very different ways, I think. And absolutely, August recess is the longest recess. Congress is hoping that they'll be beginning it on August the 10th. We'll see if the COVID work is done enough to start it, but they're at home almost for a month during that time. And so that really is why, as Disciples Justice Ministries collectively, many of us are urging congregations and regions and individuals, either as teams of all disciples or disciples together with some of your UCC and Catholic friends and others, to make visits during this long time, during this unique moment of COVID, where those visits can happen virtually, to lift up your faith values for justice at the end of this summer.
Just a follow-up, many of you mentioned talking about roles before going into a visit. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what that looks like, and any other tips and tricks what works well when planning these visits?
Well, Sharon can correct me and back me up on some of this, I suppose, but one of the things I think is, you know, we already said it, need to say it again, is prepping. You know, it's just so important. You need a note taker, somebody who's going to take the notes to be able to, so that afterwards, when you have your follow-up meeting with yourself and your group, you can talk about what happened. You know, people's memories kind of differ, and so that they can talk about what happened, how they feel about it, possible next steps, you know, that kind of thing. So a note taker is very important. Just a lot of people don't think that a note taker is there or does anything, but it's a vital role. You got to make sure people don't talk too much. They've got to stay to their allotted time. That's very important, because generally, I mean, I don't know if there's a rule. That hour that you were talking about is amazing, Sharon, but usually 20 minutes, if you got 20 minutes, you're lucky. That's the top. So if you've got to ask, you should probably do about the ask at least 3 times. Maybe at the end of the story where they say, so I hope that you 2, 3 stories short really is all you need. And then at the end, you just want to promise them to get them whatever they need. You ask them if they need anything. They might just tell you, can you get me the numbers on that? Can you get me the dollar figures on that? So you got to do it. You say you'll do it. You promise to get back to them. You do it within, I guess, 3 days at the most. You don't hear from them probably in a week or a week and a half. You get back to them again. But as I said, you make sure you get them all the information, all the people who were there, who they were, and just anything else they wanted. If you have a letter to deliver or whatever, signatures, you give it to them. You promise to follow up on that. If they ask about that, you promise to do something else. They say, well, can you do X and Y to augment this? And you thank them over and over again for the time that they are spending with you, for taking this time, for being with you. And then you continue to thank them as you follow up. And you share information with the people who are the advocates who were there. That's very important too, so they know what's going on. You keep talking to them afterwards. They don't want to just go in and then disappear, and you don't want them to either.
In terms of roles, one strategy may be to have one person take the lead in describing the ask, describing the reason for the visit and the particular perspective that the group brings. Another person may have a personal experience that they want to share, telling a story. A third person may have a particular specialty in understanding and suggesting ways that the language of the piece of legislation itself could be adjusted or changed. So, you know, getting into the specifics, and you want to have somebody, if you're talking about a piece of legislation, you want to be familiar with it, and you want to be able to discuss points of that, because that's what they are using as a basis for the conversation. So the other thing is, it's remarkable how often staffers or representatives will tell groups that I've been in, we really need to hear the voices you bring, because we don't hear them as often as we need to. We always hear from the other side. So it's really key. They may be sympathetic, but they are perhaps acting based on what they're hearing from waves of groups who are coming in with one perspective, but really aren't hearing another side of it. And sometimes we are that other side and need to be able to articulate it well. And they are often eager and happy to hear our perspective and are receptive to that. And even to the extent that they're thankful that we bring a particular faith perspective into the conversation, because many of them are people of faith, and they want to hold on to that.
Even though we hear so many reports about numbers of faith denominations sometimes reducing, still we know more than 80% of all who live in the United States are members of some community of faith. So we can maximize our impact if we find out, is that true for the legislator that we are visiting? And if so, what faith are they a part of? If we're going to go on a date, or if we're going to get to know an organization, we're likely going to do some Googling and do some research before we get to that dinner table or that table space where we're gathering. And we should be doing the same thing always before we go into a legislative meeting. That is one of the key ways that we demonstrate we respect who you are and your life commitment to serve in this position, whether we agree with how they are doing it in all aspects or not. That is one of the key ways that we can demonstrate. You never want to go in, especially not knowing the position of the legislator you're visiting that is in some way related to the ask that you are making. You should be deeply aware of some of the quotes, the previous positions that they have taken, the legislation they're supporting. If you're asking them to sign on to a piece of legislation, make sure you know if they've already done it or not. You don't want to be embarrassed by finding that out in the midst of being present in the interview. And it's always a good idea, we've found, and it tends to be a question that brings out some surprises sometimes. If you ask in your meeting before you're leaving, what are you hearing from communities of faith? Because often that question says, we're not hearing much, and it would really make a difference if we did. Or, you know what, we've heard a lot from the Catholics, but not from the Protestants, or a lot from the Christians, but not from another faith. And all of that is deeply informing, that can help you then, after we leave the meeting, think about how do we build the best strategy going forward with that leader to continue to hopefully increase their support for our point of view.
Yeah, a trick that I was going to mention of the trade or whatever is, as she was saying, do your research. And so two things off of that. One is, if they've done something you like, you know, make sure you say, well, we like that, and show a lot of appreciation. The second thing is about doing your research is, if you go in, do a specific ask as you can, you know, to vote yes or no on a particular bill, to sign on as a co-sponsor, to think about something, whatever it is, the most specific ask you can make that you feel comfortable making in this situation. So both of those have to do with research.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize enough what's been said in terms of staying on message. You know, an opportunity is in front of you, and you may have a whole list of things that you want to talk about, but it's really important to stay on message, because that's really what's going to stick with them. And like Ken said, if they have supported something that you like, even, you know, sponsoring the bill that you're in to talk about, you know, make sure that you're aware of that and that you express appreciation for that, so that they know that they have support for the position that they may have taken a risk to sign on to. So the fact that they know that there are constituents behind them who are ready and willing to be present with them is impactful.
One of the key forms of power that I feel that faith communities offer, which isn't true for every other type of community, is that we have local partnerships, we have national partnerships as a denomination, and we have global partnerships through our global ministry partners as well. And it isn't always typical that a constituent can genuinely and honestly refer back to each of those layers of relationships, and every single one of them brings with it power, and it brings with it partnerships. So the more we know about the fullness of those levels of partnership we have, the more we know about our international partnerships that relate to the dynamics in my work, let's say with refugees and immigrants nationally, that helps me speak with more authority when we're talking, and all of us speak with more authority when we're talking to our leaders.
And when the disciples' leadership has issued a statement on something, or if the General Assembly has adopted a resolution on something, it's helpful to have that in hand and say, this isn't just me talking, this is my church. So I'm here representing a large community. And many of them are your constituents too. And so to be able to have that document with you as a leave behind is helpful as well.
Absolutely. And so many legislative staff members are so grateful for those leave behinds being referred to. If you're able to be in the office, have a hard copy, but also always send it electronically, because that way they can keep it, they can share it easily with the legislative representative themselves. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I would say is that often legislative offices need the kind of information that faith communities can provide. If they're hoping to take a position but haven't had enough support behind them to do it, they may need for us to help, as again, back as Governor Rea from Disciples would say, don't just tell me you're in support of something, show me. Mm-hmm. So we have that opportunity as communities of faith to, whether it's bring together constituents to demonstrate that, or write an op-ed that can reinforce what our position is, that might then help influence a legislative official themselves to, when that article is printed in the paper locally, that can help them feel more solidified in coming out publicly as well, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that we can't do everything. I mean, I could joke and say Sharon does immigration, we do everything else in the domestic front, and Peter takes care of the world. But, you know, all of us are very busy. All these things are coming at us. So another thing we have to do is we have to figure out who in our ecumenical and interfaith partnerships already has relationships with people. I mean, because again, if they've got the relationships, let them take the lead, and we'll bring our people, if it's necessary or helpful, to the table, to the prep, to the meetings. And I think this is especially the case in Canada right now, because we're not all well versed on Canada or Canadian politics. We have some people there doing things, and our partnership with the United Church of Canada is going to be very helpful. But there are groups there that we partner with that are on the ground, like Kairos Canada and the public justice group that's there. And that's how we learn. And we don't go there ourselves, but we pull some disciples in from there too. They take the lead. So we have to be ready to find out who knows what and let them take the lead many times.
And I was just going to say that in terms of preparation for a meeting, you know, a particular disciple may be very enthusiastic about a particular issue, but may feel that they want to get more information about it. And so the national staff, whether you know, based in Washington or in Indianapolis or in Cleveland in Global Ministries or wherever, a number of issue and area experts are available. So connecting with the denominational staff who are engaged in these issues can be helpful, and we all are eager and willing and ready to help out as we can.
Yeah, that's true. I'm a witness to that, and so is Sharon, I suppose. Have to be.
Yes, yes. And I really would encourage faith partners, as you are doing legislative visits, as we are doing legislative visits, to remember, be not discouraged. You'll have a visit that feels really positive, and then you might have that be followed with one that just feels like you're in such a different place from a leader. And that is often the case, and it's not your fault. As long as you have prepared well for a visit, we can't make them agree with the perspective, but we can be confident, and we can maintain our confidence and our commitment to keep having visits even after one that might not have felt particularly comfortable, as long as you know and trust that you are living into your own faith values, and that you are expressing where God's voice, through the power of the Spirit and your discernment of Scripture, has led you to speak in that meeting. And don't stop speaking. The prophets gratefully didn't stop. Neither were they affirmed in every interchange they had. And so I have felt uplifted by the times when the prophets have felt their failure as well as their successes. And those are important moments to encourage one another, and those are another reason why it's helpful to make visits when you're able to in groups, because you are not just building a relationship with the legislator, you're building your relationships with one another, and hopefully building ones that continue to bring your voice of value to speak publicly to elected officials.
Mhm.
Thank you all so much for being willing to be a part of this conversation. I hope that as disciples are preparing during this August recess to go and meet with their members of Congress, something that can be intimidating, that this conversation helped to break it down, offer some really helpful tips, and hopefully folks will be able to go and take action. So thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much from listening to you, and I hope others will find it useful too.